Here is a particular quiet carried by those who grew up in the 1990s. Not silence exactly, but a pause, a hesitation between connection and distance. They remember a world that moved slower, where boredom existed without guilt, where attention was not constantly claimed. And yet, they were also the first to feel time accelerate. They learned how to wait. They also learned how to adapt. Their childhood was not fully analog nor fully digital. It lived in between phone calls made from walls, friendships that existed without proof, mistakes that were allowed to fade instead of being archived forever. Something subtle happened there, a psychological imprint, not dramatic, not obvious. There is often a moment subtle and easily missed when awareness begins. Not a memory tied to a single day, but a feeling that returns again and again. A sense of standing slightly apart, even while being fully present. For many who grew up in the 1990s, this awareness formed early. Childhood felt safe but not sealed. The world still allowed unsupervised afternoons, doors left unlocked, voices calling from outside instead of notifications buzzing inside pockets. And yet, beneath that freedom, there was a quiet understanding that things were shifting. Not dangerously, not urgently, just enough to be noticed. They learned how to occupy time without stimulation. Long stretches of waiting became normal. Waiting for a show to come on, waiting for a friend to arrive, waiting for a call that might never come. Boredom was not something to be fixed. It was something to be endured. And in that endurance, the mind learned to wander, to imagine, to reflect. But alongside this slowness came the first signals of acceleration. The sound of a dial-up connection. The introduction of screens that promised immediacy. The idea that information could arrive faster than experience. These changes did not replace the old world overnight. They hovered beside it. And living between those two realities required a new kind of attention. Flexible, observant, quietly alert. Emotionally, this created an early form of self-awareness. Not self-consciousness, but self-monitoring. A tendency to read the room, to sense shifts in tone before they were spoken. Adults were adapting too, often without explanation. Rules changed without discussion. Expectations evolved without warning. Children absorbed this not through language, but through feeling. Friendships during this time carried a different weight. Connection was real because it was limited. If someone left, they were gone, not just temporarily unavailable. Arguments did not echo forever. Mistakes were not replayed endlessly. This allowed a fragile sense of emotional safety. One could be known without being documented. At the same time, there was an unspoken pressure to keep up, not in performance, but in awareness, to understand new technologies without guidance, to mature emotionally while still being told to remain a child. This contradiction planted a quiet vigilance, a readiness to adjust, even when no adjustment had been requested. The first awareness, then, was not a realization of difference. It was a feeling of balance, a life lived between presence and anticipation, between trust in the moment and preparation for change. This is where the psychological pattern begins, not in trauma, not in crisis, but in subtle observation, in learning early that stability can coexist with impermanence. That comfort does not mean permanence. That adaptation is not a choice, but a condition. Long before adulthood demanded flexibility, the nervous system had already practiced it, quietly, unnoticed, and that early awareness would continue to echo, shaping how connection, safety, and identity would later be understood. Every psychological pattern has an origin, though it rarely announces itself. For those who grew up in the 1990s, the roots were not dramatic. They were ordinary, and that is what made them powerful. Home environments during this time often carried a sense of structure without constant supervision. Parents trusted time. They trusted distance. Children were expected to manage themselves in small, quiet ways, to come home when the streetlights turned on, to resolve minor conflicts without intervention, to tolerate emotional discomfort without naming it. Independence was not praised loudly. It was assumed. This assumption shaped emotional development. Feelings were real but rarely centered. Distress was acknowledged only if it interrupted function. Joy existed, but it was not curated. Life happened without explanation, and children learned to interpret it on their own. Culturally, the 1990s existed in a psychological pause. The anxieties of previous decades had softened, but the intensity of the digital age had not yet arrived. News traveled slower. Fear did not live in pockets. Global crises felt distant, abstract. Safety was not guaranteed, but it felt implied. At the same time, expectations were quietly forming. Academic performance mattered. Social adaptation mattered. But emotional literacy was still emerging. Many learned how to behave before they learned how to feel. Compliance was easier than expression. Silence was often mistaken for resilience. Media played a subtle role here. Television, music, and early internet spaces offered emotion without intimacy. Stories could be felt deeply without requiring vulnerability. This taught an important lesson. Feelings could be processed privately. One did not need to be witnessed to feel something real. But there was a cost. Emotional processing became internalized. Needs were managed inwardly rather than shared outwardly. Over time, this created a habit of self-containment, not isolation but quiet self-reliance. The gradual arrival of technology intensified this pattern. Devices entered homes without emotional instruction. Children were expected to adapt instinctively. No one explained what constant access might do to attention or self-worth. The responsibility to adjust fell silently on young minds. Family dynamics also contributed. Many households emphasized endurance. Work came first. Stability mattered more than emotional presence. Love existed, but it was often shown through provision rather than conversation. This taught a form of emotional translation, learning to interpret care without direct affirmation. These origins did not create fragility. They created adaptability. But adaptability, when practiced too early, can blur the line between strength and suppression. By the time adulthood approached, much of the emotional groundwork had already been laid. A belief that feelings should be manageable, that change is normal, that stability is temporary, that self-reliance is safer than dependence. This is where it began, not in loss, not in neglect, but in a world that quietly taught children to hold themselves together, even when no one asked them to. The human mind is shaped less by events and more by environments. For those who grew up in the 1990s, the environment itself was transitional, and the brain noticed. From a psychological perspective, childhood is a period of neural patterning. Attention, memory, emotional regulation, and identity are not fixed traits, they are learned rhythms. The 1990s offered a unique rhythm. Long stretches of low stimulation punctuated by sudden novelty. This pattern trained the brain to tolerate stillness while remaining alert for change. Before constant connectivity, attention had depth. One task at a time, one screen, if any. The mind learned how to stay with an experience until it ended. This strengthened focus, imagination, and internal dialogue. But as technology slowly entered daily life, attention was also asked to fragment. Gently at first, then more insistently. This created a cognitive flexibility that feels natural to this generation. Switching contexts became easy. Adapting to new systems felt familiar. But underneath that skill sat a nervous system that learned to stay slightly activated, ready for interruption even during rest. Memory formation followed a similar pattern. Experiences were not recorded. They were remembered. This strengthened narrative memory, the ability to recall how something felt rather than how it looked. Emotional memory became more prominent than visual documentation. Moments lived inside the body, not in archives. Emotionally, regulation developed through observation rather than instruction. Feelings were managed internally. There was little language for emotional nuance, so the brain learned to regulate by suppression or distraction. This worked well in childhood. In adulthood, it often presents as calm on the surface with tension underneath. Identity formation during this era also carried complexity. Without constant comparison, self-concept was built slowly. One could exist without being seen. But as visibility increased, identity was suddenly exposed to evaluation. The brain had to reconcile a private self with a public one, often without preparation. Psychologically, this produced an internal duality. Comfort with solitude paired with competence in social spaces. A desire for depth paired with tolerance for superficial interaction. Neither side fully dominates. Neuroscience would describe this as adaptive modulation, the ability to adjust emotional intensity based on context. It is a strength, but when overused, it can create emotional fatigue. The mind becomes skilled at adjustment, but less practiced in rest. Stress responses reflect this as well. Many from this generation appear calm under pressure. They learned early that change is survivable, but prolonged uncertainty can quietly exhaust them. The nervous system is accustomed to adapting, not settling. This is the psychological imprint of growing up between eras. A mind trained for transition, a nervous system comfortable with movement, an emotional world that is rich but often privately held. Not broken, not deficient, just shaped by a time that taught the brain to stay ready, even when nothing is happening. What forms quietly often lives quietly. The inner tension carried by those who grew up in the 1990s rarely announces itself as distress. It feels more like a low hum, always present, rarely disruptive, difficult to name. This tension exists between opposing needs: depth and speed, privacy and visibility, independence and belonging. The mind learned to value meaning, but the world increasingly rewards immediacy. And living between those two realities requires constant internal negotiation. There is a comfort with solitude that does not always translate into loneliness. Time alone feels natural. Silence feels familiar. Yet connection still matters deeply. The difficulty lies not in wanting closeness, but in trusting its durability. Relationships formed in a slower world felt anchored. Modern connections can feel provisional, easily interrupted, easily replaced. This creates emotional restraint. Not withdrawal, but careful engagement. Feelings are felt fully, but revealed selectively. Vulnerability is not avoided. It is measured. The nervous system learned early that exposure carries consequences, even if those consequences are subtle. Resistance appears here as well. Not rebellion, but hesitation. A quiet questioning of trends. A reluctance to perform identity publicly. A preference for being understood by a few rather than seen by many. This resistance is often mistaken for detachment when it is actually discernment. Anxiety, when it appears, tends to be diffuse, not tied to a specific threat, but to an atmosphere of constant change. The mind knows how quickly norms can shift. Stability feels conditional, and so vigilance persists not as fear, but as awareness. This inner tension is often masked by competence. Adaptability looks like confidence. Calm looks like certainty, but internally there is effort. The effort of staying balanced while the environment continues to accelerate. Emotional expression becomes complex under these conditions. Strong feelings are often intellectualized. Pain is contextualized. Joy is appreciated quietly. Extremes feel unnecessary. There is a preference for moderation, even when intensity might be appropriate. This does not mean emotion is absent. It means it is managed, contained, organized. The inner world is rich but carefully structured. Over time, this tension can create fatigue. Not burnout, but a subtle weariness. A sense of always adjusting without arriving. Of being capable without feeling fully settled. Yet this tension also holds value. Creates perspective. It allows for empathy across generations. It supports nuance in a polarized world. The challenge is not the tension itself. It is the invisibility of it. When something becomes normal, it becomes unexamined. And so the inner conflict remains, not as a problem to solve, but as a condition to be understood. A quiet complexity carried forward from a time that taught balance without ever naming the cost. Realization rarely arrives as a revelation. For those who grew up in the 1990s, it comes more like recognition, a soft alignment between past and present that finally makes sense. It often begins in adulthood during moments of contrast, watching younger generations move effortlessly through constant exposure. noticing how quickly opinions are formed and discarded, feeling both impressed and unsettled by the speed at which identity is expressed. Something stirs, not judgment, curiosity. There is a growing awareness of patterns, the tendency to pause before sharing, the preference for meaningful conversation over continuous interaction, the quiet exhaustion that follows prolonged digital engagement. These traits once felt personal, even isolating. Now they begin to feel contextual. The realization is not that something was missing, but that something was learned. Learned early, learned quietly, learned without explanation. Memory plays a role here, recalling childhood moments that once felt ordinary. Walking home alone, spending hours absorbed in imagination, resolving emotions internally, now reveals their psychological weight. These were not just experiences, they were training. This recognition brings a shift in self-perception. Emotional restraint is no longer mistaken for coldness. Adaptability is no longer confused with indecision. The in-between feeling begins to feel less like displacement and more like fluency. There is also grief here, not dramatic but real. Grief for a pace that no longer exists, for forms of connection that required presence, for mistakes that were allowed to disappear. This grief is not about longing to return. It is about honoring what shaped the nervous system. With realization comes compassion, toward the self that learned to adjust without guidance, toward the environment that demanded flexibility before offering language. Understanding replaces self-criticism. This is a turning point not toward change, but toward clarity. The inner tension is still there. The world is still fast, but the experience now has a frame. Patterns once endured unconsciously are now seen, and what is seen can be held more gently. The realization does not demand action. It offers permission. Permission to exist as shaped. Permission to prefer depth. Permission to move at an internal pace, even when the external world does not. This moment is quiet, but it is profound, because it transforms a lifetime of subtle adaptation into something coherent, something human, something understood. Integration does not arrive suddenly. It is a slow weaving together of threads that were once separate. The past and present, solitude and connection, vigilance and ease. For those who grew up in the 1990s, it is a process of recognizing that the lessons of childhood are not burdens, but tools quietly shaping resilience, perception, and emotional depth. The first step is noticing the patterns that were learned unconsciously. The preference for slow absorption over instant consumption. The careful observation before engagement. The ability to exist fully in solitude while still longing for connection. These traits, once thought to be odd or isolating, reveal themselves as strengths when seen through the lens of awareness. Integration also involves accepting contradiction. Adaptability coexists with fatigue. Emotional restraint coexists with profound empathy. Independence coexists with the desire for closeness. There is no need to resolve these tensions into a singular state. They are complementary parts of a nuanced inner life. Memory and narrative play a crucial role. Looking back on childhood, the long stretches of boredom, the quiet self-management, the subtle cues absorbed from shifting environments. These moments begin to make sense. They are not regrets, nor mere nostalgia. They are the foundation upon which present understanding is built. Socially, integration manifests as selective engagement. The tendency to value quality over quantity in relationships, to prefer depth over breadth, and to navigate new technologies with both curiosity and discernment. This is not withdrawal. It is a conscious calibration of energy, attention, and emotional investment. Emotionally, integration brings gentleness toward the self. The nervous system, trained for adaptation, is allowed periods of rest. Vulnerability is no longer calculated solely for safety but can be offered as a gift to trustworthy spaces. Emotional regulation becomes choice rather than habit, awareness rather than obligation. Psychologically, integration allows patterns to become tools rather than limitations. Early vigilance becomes mindful observation. Emotional restraint becomes reflective insight. Adaptability becomes creative flexibility. The tension between worlds transforms into a rhythm, a capacity to navigate change without losing the inner self. Integration also carries quiet empowerment. The awareness of having grown between eras becomes an asset, a source of empathy, a capacity for patience, and a subtle wisdom in observing both past and present. It is not flashy. It is not performance. It is presence. This chapter is not about fixing or repairing. It is about holding experience, understanding its influence, and choosing how it will inform life going forward. It is about meeting oneself fully, the child who adapted, the adolescent who negotiated, and the adult who observes. In this weaving, the 1990s are not a decade merely remembered. They are a framework of resilience, perception, and depth, quietly integrated into the person who carries them. Time moves differently for those who grew up in the 1990s. Not faster, not slower, but layered, every moment carrying echoes of the past, reverberations of adaptation, and the soft imprint of lessons learned in silence. There is a gentle understanding that life rarely offers full closure. Patterns persist, tendencies remain, but they are no longer hidden burdens. They are quiet companions, shaping perception, guiding empathy, coloring memory, and informing connection. The world continues to accelerate, but the 1990s generation carries within it a counterbalance, a patience, a capacity for depth, a comfort in stillness. They remember what it feels like to wait, to imagine, to process internally. These are not skills in the conventional sense. They are modes of being, cultivated in the spaces between eras, nurtured in the tension of transition. There is also a subtle melancholy for the simplicity of unsupervised afternoons, for friendships formed without screens, for mistakes that disappeared without record. But alongside it is a quiet strength, a knowledge that adaptation, reflection, and emotional discernment are gifts born of experience. This generation has learned that identity is layered, not linear, that connection can be fleeting yet meaningful, that solitude can be restorative, not lonely, that depth often arrives quietly, without spectacle, without recognition. The psychology of those who grew up in the 1990s is not a story of nostalgia, nor of loss, nor of triumph. It is a story of endurance, reflection, and subtle growth, a story written not in grand gestures, but in small, intimate ways, in the pauses, the observations, the internalized lessons that continue to shape perception and presence. And in this quiet continuation, there is a soft beauty, a gentle affirmation that life lived between worlds is not diminished by its in-between nature. It is enriched. It carries both memory and anticipation, stillness and readiness, reflection and action. The world moves on, but this generation moves within it with a calm understanding that the spaces in between, the pauses, the waiting, the quiet awareness, are not empty. They are fertile, they are instructive, they are profoundly human. And so the story does not end. It unfolds continuously, carried forward by those who remember both the world that was and the world that is, shaping their inner lives in a quiet, enduring rhythm, a testament to what it means to grow, adapt, and feel deeply in a time of change.